The manager pointed his finger at her like she was a stranger begging for scraps. "Ma'am, this hotel is for paying guests only. I need you to leave right now, or I will call security." Simone Carter did not move. She stood in the middle of the marble lobby of the Everline Grand, the very hotel her company had built from the ground up, and she said nothing. Guests turned to stare. Someone laughed behind a phone camera. The manager did not know that the woman he was humiliating held the deed to the building beneath his feet. He did not know that in less than 1 hour, his name would be pulled from a file that could end everything he had worked for. And he had no idea that this moment, this one arrogant decision, was about to unlock a secret that had been buried inside her own family for over 20 years. If you love stories about strong women rising above injustice, hit subscribe now, because this story is about to take a turn nobody sees coming. Simone Carter had learned a long time ago that power does not always announce itself. It does not always walk into a room wearing a tailored suit or dripping in diamonds. Sometimes power walks in wearing a plain gray hoodie, worn sneakers, and a canvas tote bag from a farmer's market in Atlanta. That was exactly how she looked on the Tuesday morning she stepped through the revolving doors of the Everline Grand Hotel in downtown Chicago. She had flown in on a red-eye from Los Angeles after 3 days of back-to-back meetings, and she wanted nothing more than a quiet cup of coffee before her afternoon board call. She was not there to prove anything. She was not there to test anyone. She simply wanted a moment of peace in a building she had poured 7 years of her life into creating. The lobby of the Everline Grand was breathtaking, the kind of space designed to make ordinary people feel like royalty for a single night. Marble floors stretched in every direction, catching the light from a chandelier the size of a small car. Fresh white orchids sat on every table. A pianist played something soft, near the far wall. Simone walked toward the cafe tucked into the corner of the lobby, her eyes scanning the space the way they always did, checking the details, the way she checked every property she owned. The gold trim was polished. The staff uniforms were crisp. Everything looked exactly as it should. What she did not expect was the man who stepped directly into her path before she reached the counter. His name tag read, Bradley Sims, Hotel Manager. He was tall, clean-shaven, with the kind of posture that came from years of being told he belonged in rooms like this one. He looked Simone up and down, his eyes lingering on her sneakers, her tote bag, the small wrinkle in her hoodie from the flight. "Excuse me," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the soft piano music. "This lobby is for hotel guests only. Are you currently staying with us?" Simone blinked, caught off guard for only a second. "I was just going to grab a coffee," she said calmly. "I don't need a room for that." Bradley's jaw tightened. "I'm going to need you to leave the premises. We've had some incidents lately, with people coming in off the street, and I can't have that kind of thing happening in my lobby." The words hit her like a slap, though her face did not show it. My lobby. She almost laughed. Instead, she took a breath and tried again, keeping her voice even. "I think there's a misunderstanding," she said. "I'm not here to cause any trouble. I just want coffee." Bradley crossed his arms. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time to leave, or I'll have to call security." A few guests near the cafe had stopped talking. 2 women in expensive coats exchanged a glance, and then quickly looked away. The kind of look that said they had seen this before, and knew exactly how it would end. A young man near the concierge desk lifted his phone, angling it towards Simone without even trying to hide it. Simone felt something old and familiar rise in her chest, a memory of being 19 years old and being followed through a department store because a security guard did not like the way she looked in her second-hand coat. She had promised herself back then that one day she would build something so big, so undeniable, that no one would ever question whether she belonged in a room again. And yet here she was, decades later, net worth in the billions, standing in a hotel that legally belonged to her, being told she did not belong. She thought about walking away quietly. She thought about pulling out her phone and calling her assistant to handle it from a distance, the way she usually did with problems like this. But something in her refused to move. "Before you call security," Simone said, her voice steady and quiet, "I think you should check who owns this building." Bradley let out a short laugh, the kind of laugh that comes from someone who has never once been wrong about a first impression. "Ma'am, I don't have time for this. I manage this hotel. I know exactly who owns it. And I promise you, it isn't you." He turned slightly toward the concierge desk. "Diane, can you call security to the main lobby, please?" A young woman behind the desk hesitated, glancing nervously at Simone, then nodded and reached for the phone. Simone reached into her tote bag and pulled out a slim black folder she always carried, the kind most people would assume held travel documents or a laptop charger. Inside was a single laminated card, an executive access badge for Carter Holdings Group, the parent company that owned the Everline Grand and 11 other luxury properties across the country. She placed it on the counter without a word. Bradley glanced down at it, his expression shifting from irritation to confusion. "What is this?" he asked. "This is a corporate badge," Simone said. "You might want to look closer at the name." Bradley picked up the card, his eyes moving over the embossed letters. "Carter Holdings Group, Executive Director of Operations, Simone A. Carter." His face went pale, but his pride was not ready to surrender. "This could be fake," he said, though his voice had lost its confidence. "Anyone can print a card like this." Simone almost admired his stubbornness. "Almost." "You're right," she said. "Anyone can print a card. That's why I'd also like you to pull up the ownership records for this property. I believe you have access to the corporate portal from the manager's terminal behind the front desk." Bradley did not move. Diane, still holding the phone, slowly set it back down, watching the exchange with wide eyes. "Sir," Simone said, using the word deliberately, watching how it landed differently now than it had a moment ago. "I would like you to check the records, right now, please." Something in her tone had changed, not louder, not angrier, but heavier, the kind of voice that came from someone used to being obeyed in boardrooms 20 floors above street level. Bradley's throat moved as he swallowed. He turned toward the front desk, his steps slower than before, and Simone followed, the lobby around them growing quieter as more guests noticed the tension building near the concierge station. The manager sat down at the terminal, his fingers trembling slightly as he typed in his credentials. He pulled up the corporate ownership database, a system every hotel manager had access to but rarely used unless there was an audit or a legal matter. He typed in the property code for the Everline Grand Chicago. The screen loaded, and there, at the top of the ownership hierarchy, was a name that made his stomach drop. Carter Holdings Group LLC, majority shareholder and founder, Simone A. Carter, 91% ownership. Bradley stared at the screen for a long moment, his mouth slightly open, no words coming out. He read it again, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something less humiliating. "That's," he started, then stopped. He looked up at Simone, and for the first time since she had walked through the revolving doors, he actually saw her. Not the hoodie, not the sneakers, her. "I own 91% of this hotel," Simone said quietly. "I own 91% of 11 other hotels in this company's portfolio. I signed the paperwork for this building's construction in a conference room 8 floors above where we are standing right now." She paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of it to settle into the room. "And about 6 minutes ago, you told me I don't belong here." Bradley's face had gone from pale to something closer to gray. Diane, behind the desk, had covered her mouth with her hand. The young man with the phone had lowered it slowly, no longer filming for entertainment, sensing that he was witnessing something far more serious than a viral moment. "Miss Carter, I am so sorry," Bradley stammered, standing up so fast his chair nearly tipped backward. "I had no idea. If I had known who you were, I never would have." Simone held up a hand, cutting him off gently but firmly. "That's exactly the problem," she said. "You shouldn't need to know who I am to treat me like a human being." The words landed heavier than any threat could have. Bradley opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Around them, the lobby had gone almost completely silent, the piano still playing softly in the background, oblivious to the storm that had just passed through the room. What none of them knew, not Bradley, not Diane, not the guests watching from a careful distance, was that this humiliating morning was only the beginning. Because tucked inside Simone's tote bag, beneath the folder with her executive badge, was a letter she had received 2 days earlier from a lawyer in Savannah, Georgia. A letter about a will. A letter about a man she had not spoken to in 15 years. A letter that was about to pull her back into a family she had tried very hard to leave behind, and into a fight for something far more valuable than a single hotel lobby. Simone Carter had not always been the woman who owned buildings like the Everline Grand. She had grown up in a small house on the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia, raised mostly by her grandmother after her mother passed away when Simone was only 11 years old. Her father, a man named Elijah Carter, had been in and out of her life the way weather moves through a season, sometimes warm and present, other times gone without explanation for months at a time. He remarried when Simone was 14 to a woman named Renata, and together they had a son, Simone's half-brother, Marcus. The two children grew up under the same roof for a handful of years, though the distance between them never fully closed, not because of anything Marcus did, but because Renata made it clear from the beginning that Simone was a guest in her own father's house. By the time Simone turned 18, she had left for college on a partial scholarship, working 3 jobs to cover what the scholarship did not, sleeping some nights in the campus library because she could not afford both rent and textbooks in the same month. She studied business and real estate finance, driven by a hunger that had nothing to do with proving her worth to her father's new family, and everything to do with never again feeling the particular kind of powerlessness that came from having no options. She graduated with honors, took an entry-level position at a small property management firm in Atlanta, and within 4 years had saved enough to make her first investment, a rundown duplex in a neighborhood everyone told her was a mistake. It was not a mistake. Simone renovated the property herself on nights and weekends, learning plumbing and drywall from online videos because she could not afford contractors. She sold it 18 months later for triple what she had paid and used the profit to buy 2 more properties. That was the beginning of what would eventually become Carter Holdings Group, a company that started with duplexes in overlooked neighborhoods and grew, over the course of 15 years, into a real estate empire spanning residential developments, commercial buildings, and eventually, luxury hospitality. The Everline Grand had been her first hotel, built from an abandoned textile warehouse she had purchased for almost nothing because everyone else believed the location was worthless. She had seen something different. She always did. Her father had died 6 years earlier, a heart attack that took him quickly and without warning. Simone had attended the funeral out of obligation more than grief, standing at the back of the church while Renata and Marcus received condolences at the front. She had not spoken to either of them since. There had been no dramatic falling out, no single explosive argument that severed the relationship. It had simply eroded over years of small cruelties, comments about her difficult personality, jokes at family gatherings about how she always had to be the smart one, the successful one, as if her achievements were an accusation against everyone who had not achieved the same. Eventually, Simone stopped attending the gatherings altogether, and no one seemed to notice her absence, which told her everything she needed to know about how much she had actually been wanted in that house. 2 days before the incident at the Everline Grand, Simone had received a call from a lawyer named Harold Whitfield, representing the estate of her father. The call surprised her, since she had assumed the estate had been settled years earlier. Harold explained that a dispute had arisen regarding a property her father had owned outside of Savannah, a piece of land that had been held in a trust with unusually specific conditions attached to its release. The land, it turned out, was not simply a piece of land. Buried within decades-old paperwork was a reference to mineral and development rights that had recently become extremely valuable due to a new commercial corridor being built nearby. Marcus, now 31 years old and running a struggling construction company, had filed a claim asserting that he was the sole rightful heir to the property and that Simone had been intentionally excluded from their father's will. Simone had not cared much about the land itself. She had more wealth than she could spend in several lifetimes. What stopped her cold was a single detail Harold mentioned almost as an afterthought. The trust required a specific document to be located and verified before any release of the property could occur. A letter written by her father himself, sealed and filed separately from the rest of the estate paperwork. Harold could not disclose the contents of the letter over the phone, only that it directly named Simone, and that legally, the letter needed to be opened in person, with both potential heirs present, within 30 days, or the property would default to the state under an obscure clause in Georgia trust law. Simone had agreed to fly to Savannah the following week. She had not expected the trip to begin with a stranger accusing her of not belonging in her own hotel lobby. Back in the lobby of the Everline Grand, Bradley Sims had not stopped apologizing since the moment he read the ownership records on the terminal screen. "Miss Carter, please, let me call the regional director. Let me make this right somehow. I can comp your stay, I can." Simone raised a hand again, and he fell silent immediately, the way people do when they suddenly understand the true weight of the person in front of them. "I don't need a comp stay, Mr. Sims," she said. "I need you to understand something. This is not about me. I can absorb this kind of treatment because I have the resources to walk away and never think about it again. But there are guests who walk through those doors every single day who do not have that kind of protection. People who get treated exactly the way you just treated me and who have no laminated badge to pull out of their bag to prove they deserve basic respect." Bradley nodded slowly, his eyes lowered. The arrogance that had filled him 15 minutes earlier now completely drained away. "I understand," he said quietly. "I don't think you do. Not yet," Simone replied, not unkindly, but with the clarity of someone who had spent years learning to separate emotion from consequence. "But you're going to have time to think about it. I want a full review of this property's guest service policies on my desk by Friday. I want to know how many complaints of this nature have been filed against this hotel in the last 2 years, and I want to know why none of them reached my office." Diane, still standing behind the desk, shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Bradley with an expression that suggested this was not the first time something like this had happened. Simone caught the look. "Diane, is it?" she asked, turning toward the young woman. Diane nodded, clearly nervous. "Yes, ma'am. Is there something you'd like to tell me?" Simone asked gently. Diane hesitated, glancing at Bradley, then back at Simone. "There have been other complaints," she said quietly. "Guests who felt like they were treated differently, mostly guests of color. I tried to report it to corporate a few months ago, but I never heard anything back." Bradley's face flushed, but he said nothing, too aware of how precarious his position had suddenly become. Simone felt something cold settle in her chest, the particular anger that comes not from a single bad moment, but from discovering that the moment was part of a pattern someone had chosen to ignore. "Deanne, I want your name and contact information," Simone said. "I'll be reaching out personally." Diane nodded quickly, relief and disbelief mixing on her face. Simone turned back to Bradley. "You're suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation," she said. "Human Resources will contact you within 24 hours. Bradley opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again, understanding that there was nothing left to say. Simone picked up her tote bag, nodded once to Diane, and walked toward the elevator, her coffee still unpurchased, her flight still fresh in her bones, and her mind already shifting toward the letter waiting for her in Savannah. The flight to Savannah 3 days later felt longer than it should have, though the distance was short. Simone sat by the window, watching clouds drift beneath the plane, her thoughts circling the same unanswered question over and over. What could her father have written that required a sealed letter, a trust condition, and a 30-day legal deadline? She had spent the days since the hotel incident trying to focus on Carter Holdings' business, reviewing the guest complaint data Bradley's suspension had unearthed, discovering with a mixture of anger and vindication that Diane had been right, that at least 6 other formal complaints had been filed against the Everline Grand over the past 2 years, all involving guests of color, all of them quietly buried by a regional manager who had since been removed from his position. It was progress, though it did little to soften the ache of what waited for her in Georgia. Harold Whitfield's office sat on a quiet street, lined with old oak trees, the kind of building that looked like it had been standing since before the Civil War, its brick facade softened by ivy and time. Simone arrived 10 minutes early, dressed now in a tailored navy suit, her armor for whatever conversation was about to unfold. She had chosen the suit deliberately this time, not because she needed to prove anything, but because she wanted Marcus to see, immediately and without question, exactly who had walked through the door. Marcus was already seated in the small conference room when she entered, and the years had changed him more than she expected. Gone was the lanky teenager she remembered from family gatherings she had long since stopped attending. In his place sat a tired-looking man with lines around his eyes that spoke of stress rather than age, his construction company clearly weighing on him more heavily than his confident posture tried to suggest. He stood when she entered, his expression unreadable. "Simone," he said, "it's been a long time." "It has," she replied, taking the seat across from him without offering a hug, without pretending the years of silence had not happened. Harold entered a moment later, a thin folder tucked under his arm, his expression carrying the particular gravity of a man who had spent 30 years delivering difficult news to families. "Thank you both for coming," he said, settling into his chair. "Before I open this letter, I need to explain the legal framework, because it's somewhat unusual." He explained that Elijah Carter had established a trust nearly 20 years earlier, long before his death, containing a parcel of land just outside Savannah that had, at the time, been considered nearly worthless swampland. The trust stipulated that the land could not be sold, developed, or claimed by any heir until a sealed letter, written by Elijah himself, was opened in the presence of both named beneficiaries, Simone and Marcus, and only after both had reached the age of 30. Marcus had just turned 31. The land, due to a new highway expansion project connecting Savannah to a growing logistics corridor, had increased in value by an almost unbelievable margin, now estimated at nearly $18 million in potential development rights. Marcus's jaw tightened at the number, and Simone noticed his hands curl slightly against the table, the movement of a man who had clearly been counting on that money to save something in his life she did not yet understand. "I filed the claim because our father promised me that land," Marcus said, his voice tight. "He told me when I was 20 years old that it would be mine one day, to build something for my family. He never mentioned you being part of it." Simone felt the familiar sting of exclusion, an old wound reopening, though she kept her expression calm. "I didn't come here for the land, Marcus," she said quietly. "I came because Harold said there's a letter with my name on it, and I think we both deserve to know what it says, before either of us assumes anything." Harold nodded, sliding the sealed envelope onto the table between them. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, Elijah's handwriting visible through the faded ink of the address line, both their names written side by side. Marcus stared at it like it might bite him. Simone reached forward and broke the seal herself, her fingers steady despite the pounding in her chest. She unfolded the letter and began to read aloud, her voice carrying into the quiet room. "To my children, Simone and Marcus. If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and it means you have both reached an age where I hope you can understand what I was too much of a coward to explain while I was alive." Simone paused, glancing at Marcus, who had gone very still. She continued reading. "Simone, I know I failed you. I let Renata's resentment toward your mother poison the way I treated you, and I let my own guilt keep me distant instead of close. I told myself for years that giving you space was a kindness, but it was cowardice, and I am sorry for every birthday I missed, and every moment I let you believe you were less important than your brother." Simone's throat tightened, an old grief rising unexpectedly, sharp and unhealed despite the years and the success and the empire she had built to outrun it. She kept reading, her voice steadier than she felt. "Marcus, I also failed you, in a different way. I let you believe that this land was a gift meant only for you, because it was easier than explaining the truth, that this land was always meant to be shared equally between you and your sister. I told you it would be yours, because I did not have the courage to tell you that Simone deserved it just as much, and I was afraid you would resent her the way your mother did." The room had gone completely silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Marcus's face had drained of color, his earlier certainty crumbling into something far more complicated. Simone continued to the final paragraph. "This land is not just soil. It sits above mineral rights I secured decades ago, rights that I always believed would one day be worth more than either of you could imagine. I am leaving it to both of you, equally, not because the law requires it, but because it is the only way I know how to say, after everything, that I loved you both the same, even when my actions never showed it. Build something together, or build something separate, but build it as siblings, not as strangers. I am sorry I did not give you the time to learn that while I was alive." Simone set the letter down, her hands trembling slightly despite years of practice keeping her composure in far more hostile rooms than this one. Marcus said nothing for a long moment, staring at the letter as though it might rearrange itself into words he could accept more easily. "He told me it was mine," he finally said, his voice cracking. "He told me for years, Simone. I built my whole company around the idea that this land would come through eventually, that I'd finally have something real to build on, instead of scraping by on contracts that barely cover payroll." Simone watched him, the anger she had carried for 15 years shifting slowly into something closer to understanding. "He lied to both of us, Marcus," she said quietly, "in different ways. He let me believe I was never enough to be part of this family, and he let you believe you didn't have to share anything with the sister he made invisible." Marcus looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed. "I didn't know," he said. "I swear, Simone, I didn't know he pushed you out the way he did. I just thought you didn't want anything to do with us." The confession hung in the air, heavy and unresolved, but something in it cracked open a door that had been sealed shut for a decade and a half. Harold cleared his throat gently. "The legal matter is straightforward," he said. "The land is to be split equally, 50% ownership to each of you, according to the terms of the trust. What you choose to do with that ownership, of course, is entirely up to you." Simone looked at Marcus, seeing for the first time not the golden child who had displaced her in their father's affection, but a man who had also been failed, just in a quieter, less visible way. "What's your construction company working on right now?" she asked. Marcus blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Small residential jobs, mostly," he said. "We almost lost the business last year. I had to lay off half my crew." Simone nodded slowly, an idea beginning to take shape. The same instinct that had once seen value in an abandoned textile warehouse, now recognizing something else entirely. "What if we didn't split the land and walk away from each other?" Simone said. "What if we built something on it together? Your construction company, my development company, a project that actually belongs to both of us, not because a will forced it, but because we chose it." Marcus stared at her, disbelief and something like hope flickering across his tired face. "You would trust me with something like that? After everything?" Simone considered the question honestly before answering. "I don't fully trust you yet," she said. "But I don't think either of us was ever really given the chance to know each other without our father standing between us, deciding who mattered more. Maybe it's time we found out for ourselves." The weeks that followed were not simple. Building any kind of partnership after 15 years of silence required more than a single emotional conversation in a lawyer's office. There were tense phone calls, moments where old resentments flared unexpectedly, arguments about zoning permits that became, without either of them fully realizing it, arguments about far older wounds. Renata, when she learned of the arrangement, was furious, showing up uninvited to one of their planning meetings and accusing Simone of manipulating Marcus for her own financial gain, accusation that would have been laughable to anyone who understood Simone's actual net worth, but which still stung with the particular pain of being permanently cast as the villain in a story she had never chosen to be part of. Simone handled it the way she handled most conflicts in her professional life, with documentation, transparency, and an unwillingness to be baited into an emotional reaction that would only prove Renata's narrative correct. Had Harold draft a clear, binding partnership agreement outlining exactly how profits, decisions, and responsibilities would be divided, protecting Marcus's construction company from being swallowed by the much larger Carter Holdings Group, while ensuring her own expertise in large-scale development guided the project towards something sustainable rather than another failed venture. Marcus, for his part, began showing up differently too, asking questions instead of assuming, listening in meetings instead of defending old grievances, slowly rebuilding a trust that had been broken long before either of them had the power to fix it themselves. Meanwhile, back in Chicago, the fallout from the Everline Grand incident had grown far larger than Simone initially anticipated. The video the young man had started filming in the lobby, though he stopped before capturing the most dramatic moment, had still captured enough: a black woman in casual clothes being confronted and nearly removed from a luxury hotel, and it had found its way onto social media, gaining traction rapidly as commenters speculated about what happened next. When word spread that the woman in the video was, in fact, the billionaire founder of the very company that owned the hotel, the story exploded into national news, picked up by outlets eager to cover a narrative of corporate accountability and racial bias colliding in such a public, undeniable way. Simone had not sought the attention, but she recognized quickly that she could not simply retreat from it either. She agreed to a single television interview, choosing her words with the same precision she used in board meetings, refusing to sensationalize the moment, while also refusing to let it be minimized. "This is not a story about one bad manager," she said during the interview, her voice calm but unwavering. "It's a story about how easily bias hides inside systems that no one bothers to examine, until someone with enough power forces the examination. My concern isn't just what happened to me, it's how many people this happened to before me, who didn't have a laminated badge to change the outcome." The interview struck a chord far beyond what she expected, prompting other hotel chains to quietly announce internal bias training reviews and prompting a wave of former Everline Grand guests across multiple properties to come forward with their own stories, some of which had been buried for years. The investigation into Carter Holdings' guest services division revealed something Simone had not fully anticipated: a pattern of complaints that had been systematically suppressed by a mid-level operations director named Gregory Hale, a man who had worked for the company since its early growth years and had built a reputation as reliable, efficient, and well-liked among senior leadership. Gregory, it turned out, had been quietly instructing regional managers to handle complaints of racial bias internally, without escalating them to corporate, framing the practice as protecting the company's reputation rather than what it actually was, protecting his own department's performance metrics from scrutiny. When Simone confronted Gregory directly, in a meeting that felt strikingly similar in tension to the one in the Savannah law office weeks earlier, he did not deny the accusations outright, but instead tried to reframe them. "Simone, I want you to understand, I was protecting the company," he said, his voice carrying the practiced calm of someone used to controlling a room. "Every business has to manage its image. If every complaint went public, we'd be dealing with a crisis every single week." Simone studied him for a long moment, recognizing in his justification the same quiet arrogance Bradley Sims had shown in the lobby, dressed up in more sophisticated language, but rooted in the same fundamental belief that some people's dignity was simply less important than the company's convenience. You weren't protecting the company, Gregory, she said finally. You were protecting yourself. And in doing so, you let guests, people who trusted us with their money and their time, walk away feeling like they didn't matter. That's not a reputation problem. That's a moral failure, and it happened on your watch. For years, while I trusted you to run that division with integrity. Gregory's composure finally cracked. You weren't even paying attention to guest services, Simone. You were too busy expanding, buying new properties, chasing bigger deals. I was the one actually running things day to day. The accusation landed with an uncomfortable sting of truth, and Simone allowed herself a moment to sit with it honestly before responding. You're right that I trusted you to handle things I wasn't paying close enough attention to, she said. That's on me, and I'm going to fix it. But that doesn't excuse what you did. You had a choice every single time a complaint crossed your desk, and you chose silence over accountability, every time. Gregory was terminated that afternoon, and Simone spent the following month personally reviewing every guest services policy across all 12 Carter Holdings properties, implementing a new complaint escalation system that bypassed regional management entirely for any issue involving discrimination, routing those cases directly to a newly created corporate oversight committee, one that included, at Simone's insistence, employees from diverse backgrounds and ranks, including Diane, the young concierge from the Everline Grand, who Simone had personally promoted to a corporate liaison role after learning how many times she had tried, unsuccessfully, to raise concerns before anyone listened. Back in Savannah, the land project, which Marcus and Simone had begun calling the Carter Commons in a rare moment of shared humor about their complicated family name, was beginning to take real shape. Simone brought in her development team to design a mixed-use space, affordable housing units alongside small business storefronts, intentionally built to serve the surrounding community rather than displace it, a principle she insisted on from the very beginning, despite pressure from some investors who saw greater profit in a purely luxury development. Marcus's construction company was brought on as lead contractor, his crew rehired and expanded, his business finally given the stability he had spent years chasing without ever quite reaching. It was during a site visit, walking the cleared land together as surveyors marked boundaries around them, that Marcus finally said the thing Simone realized she had been waiting 15 years to hear. I used to be jealous of you, he admitted, kicking at a patch of dirt with his boot, not quite meeting her eyes. Every time your name came up at dinner, it felt like I was being compared to something I could never measure up to. I didn't understand back then that you weren't even in the room to defend yourself. I just absorbed everything my mom said about you because it was easier than questioning it. Simone let the confession settle before responding. I spent a long time believing I had to build something enormous, just to prove I mattered, she said. Turns out I already mattered. I just needed people willing to actually see it. Marcus nodded slowly. I see it now, he said. I'm sorry it took losing almost everything to finally understand that. The grand opening of the Carter Commons took place 11 months later, on a warm Savannah evening filled with string lights and live music from a local jazz trio Marcus had insisted on hiring, wanting the development to feel like it belonged to the community, rather than something imposed upon it. Simone stood near the entrance of the new community center, watching families walk through the space for the first time, children running across the courtyard, an elderly woman crying quietly as she toured one of the newly completed affordable units, explaining to a volunteer that she had been priced out of her old neighborhood 2 years earlier and never thought she would be able to afford to live somewhere this nice again. Harold Whitfield attended the opening as well, standing beside Simone with a small, satisfied smile. Your father would be proud of this, he said, gesturing toward the courtyard, where Marcus was laughing with a group of new tenants, more relaxed and confident than Simone had seen him in the entire process. I don't know if he would have been, Simone admitted honestly, but I think he would have been relieved that we found a way to fix what he couldn't. She paused, watching Marcus wave her over to meet a young couple who had just signed a lease on their first storefront. a small bakery they had dreamed of opening for years. Simone smiled and walked toward them, feeling something settle inside her chest that had been unsettled for the better part of 2 decades. Bradley Sims, months after his suspension, sent Simone a letter, not through corporate channels, but a handwritten note mailed directly to her office. He explained that the investigation had led to his termination, as expected, but that the experience had forced him to confront patterns in his own behavior he had never honestly examined, biases he had inherited without ever questioning where they came from. He was now working with a nonprofit organization focused on hospitality industry training around inclusive guest service, using his own failure as a case study to teach others what not to become. Simone read the letter twice before setting it aside, feeling a complicated mixture of vindication and quiet hope, the kind that comes from watching accountability actually produce change rather than simply punishment. A year after the incident at the Everline Grand, Simone stood once again in that same lobby, though this time under very different circumstances. Carter Holdings had organized a company-wide leadership summit, bringing together managers from all 12 properties to walk through the new guest services training program, one built directly from the lessons of that single humiliating morning. Diane, now a corporate liaison with her own office and a seat at the leadership table, stood beside Simone as new managers filed into the same lobby where everything had begun. "Feels different in here now, doesn't it?" Diane said quietly. Simone looked around at the marble floors, the chandelier still catching the light exactly as it had before, but the room somehow transformed by everything that had happened within it. "It does," Simone agreed. "Not because the building changed, because the people running it finally understand what it's supposed to represent," she thought, standing there, about the version of herself who had walked through those revolving doors wearing a plain gray hoodie, wanting nothing more than a quiet cup of coffee, never expecting that a stranger's arrogance would unravel a chain of events reaching all the way back to a sealed letter in Savannah, a broken family slowly repairing itself, and a company finally being forced to look honestly at itself in the mirror. She thought about her father's words, about building something together rather than as strangers, and how strange it was that his final act of cowardice had somehow become the catalyst for the bravest, most honest chapter of both her life and her brother's. Simone Carter had spent years believing that success was measured in buildings owned, deals closed, and empires built from nothing. Standing in that lobby, watching a room full of managers learn how to treat every single guest with the same dignity, regardless of what they were wearing or what assumptions might tempt them, she understood something far more valuable than any number on a balance sheet. Power was never really about the buildings or the money or the ownership records buried in a corporate database. It was about what a person chose to do once they had it, whether they used it to lift others who had been pushed down the way she once had, or whether they simply became another version of the very people who had once made her feel small. She had chosen, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt completely, fully, unmistakably at home, in a space that finally, truly, belonged to everyone who walked through its doors.